So maybe you've picked up on the fact that we might be talking about the road to Emmaus today. I think I'm a little live. You can turn me down a little bit. And it might be when I walk away a little bit. So we're looking at Luke 24 today, starting with the 13th chapter. There we go. Thank you. And now, that same day, two of them were going to a village called Emmaus, which is about 7 miles from Jerusalem. And they were talking with each other about what had happened. And as they talked and discussed these things with each other, Jesus himself came up to them and walked along with them. But they were kept from recognizing him. He asked them, "What are you guys discussing as you walk along?" And they stood still, and their faces were downcast. So it's the first day after Jesus is resurrected. It's the evening of Easter. Two of Jesus' disciples are walking home from Jerusalem. The party was over. He'd been nailed to a cross and put in a tomb. They'd hoped that he'd be the one to redeem Israel. And now they were going to have to look for someone else. They were dejected. They were really sad. They were defeated. Maybe they were even just a little bit scared. Maybe that's why they were leaving Jerusalem. So let's continue on with verse 15. There we go. As they talked and discussed these things with each other, Jesus had came up with them and walked along with them, but they were kept from recognizing him. He asked them, "What are you discussing together as you walk along?" And they stood still, and their faces were downcast. Cleopas asked him, "Are you not the only visitor in Jerusalem to not know the things that have happened there in these days?" "What things?" he asked. You gotta love when technology almost works. "About Jesus of Nazareth," they replied. "He was a prophet. He was powerful in word and deed before God and all people. The chief priests and our rulers handed him over to be sentenced to death, and they crucified him. But we had hoped that he would be the one that was going to redeem Israel. And what is more, it's the third day since all this took place. In addition, some of our women amazed us. They went to the tomb this morning, but they didn't find his body. They came and they told us that they had seen a vision of angels who said that he was alive. And some of our companions, they went to the tomb. They were on a 7-mile walk back home to Emmaus, and this guy who didn't seem to really have much of a clue about what was going on comes along. As they're walking along, and he joins them. "What's up, guys? What's up, guys?" Now, we know that the clueless guy was Jesus. And we know that he's definitely not dead. In fact, he's probably more alive than he's ever been. And he's ready to go on a 7-mile walk, which means that his feet, which had nails in them, must have been. And he's ready to go on a 7-mile walk, which means that his feet, which had nails in them, must not hurt anymore. And they didn't recognize him. So one of these guys, his name was Cleopas. If we know the main body of the disciples, we know that Cleopas wasn't one of the main. Some scholars think maybe it was actually Luke, the guy that wrote the book, which explains why maybe there's so much detail in the telling of this story, because he was there. Now, this story is covered in the other Gospels. This story is covered in the other Gospels. So Mark covers the story in 2 verses. And if I were preaching on that, the sermon would be a whole heck of a lot shorter today, but sorry. Now, maybe they didn't recognize Jesus, know who he was. Is that possible? Or is it more possible that maybe, for all they knew, Jesus was dead? So why would they expect Jesus to walk up to them and start talking to them? Who knows? Maybe one of them said, he does look a little bit like Jesus, but Jesus is dead. So we don't know. So let's continue into the story. He said to them, "How foolish you are, how slow of heart to believe that what all the prophets have spoken. Did not Christ have to suffer these things and then enter into his glory?" And beginning with Moses and the prophets, he went through and he explained to them what was said in all the scriptures concerning himself. Wow. All of a sudden, Mr. Clueless is calling them fools. He's calling them fools. He's schooling them on everything that he's been teaching them about and everything that the Bible has been saying about him. Now, if it were me and another guy, while he's sitting there telling us how stupid we are, I'd be looking behind us. Up with this guy. A mile walk, not a paved bike path, I'm sure. So maybe it took a little bit of time. So they're walking along. Now they're at the outskirts of Emmaus. Let's keep reading. As they approached the village to which they were going, Jesus asked us if he's going to keep going further. And they urged him strongly, "No, stay with us." It's almost evening. The day is almost over. So he went in and he stayed with them. They made dinner. When he was at the table with them, he took bread. He gave thanks. He broke it and began to give it to them. And their eyes were open. He gave thanks. He broke it and began to give it to them. And their eyes were open and they recognized him. And he disappeared again. So Jesus is acting like he's going to keep walking. It's nearly the end of the day. I don't know what time they took off. If it's like my family, it didn't sound like they got off right. They get to Emmaus, and the men invite them to stay with them. Now, I don't know about you, but if I'd been called a fool and been lectured for 2-3 hours on things that I thought I knew and maybe didn't, I might not have been quite so gracious. Luckily, these guys were. And so Jesus joins them. He's sitting at the table, and he breaks bread, and boom, V8 moment. I could have had a V8. They see him. I get it. You're Jesus. Boom, he disappears. Looking at these Easter stories, we kind of get an idea that Jesus is that he can do now. Let's keep reading. So they asked each other, were not our hearts burning within us while he talked with us on the road and he opened the scriptures to us? So they got up and they returned once to Jerusalem. There they found the 11 and those with them all assembled together and saying, "It's true, the Lord is risen. He's appeared to Simon." And the two of them told the other disciples exactly what had happened and how they recognized Jesus when he broke the bread. So, yeah, they were a little angry. Didn't really like being called fools, but they recovered their composure quickly. And now they're going to head those 7 miles back to Jerusalem. It's the end of the day. The sun's going down, which is about when the thieves and the wild animals come out on those rural roads. But they decided to chance it anyway to go tell the disciples. They get there, and they find the disciples and those with them, and as we heard last week, minus Thomas, told them what they had experienced, and maybe even a little sheepishly said, "Yeah, we didn't recognize him until he broke the bread." What do you think the disciples' reaction might have been? Do you think they believed him any more than they believed the women earlier in the day? In the next few verses, we hear that Jesus appears to the entire group. Now, first, they're not sure if he's a ghost, if he's real, if it's the beginning of a zombie apocalypse. They're not sure. So he assures them that he's real. By asking for something to eat. to prove that he's real. And it makes sense. After all, it's been since Thursday since the man had a decent meal. So he's a little hungry. But that's a different sermon. So he sits with them, he eats with them, he talks with them, and disappears. And then Thomas shows up. Again, we've heard about that last week. So as we've heard over the past few weeks, there's been a whole spate of people who know Jesus and don't recognize him. On Easter, you have Mary asks her why she's crying. She turns to him and says, "Where have you taken him?" And she doesn't recognize him until he says her name. You've got these two guys who've been following Jesus for the better part of 3 years, probably. They didn't recognize him until he broke the bread. And we know that the scripture says that Jesus made it so that they wouldn't recognize him, but think about it. If Luke is the guy that really wrote the story, wrote the book, and he was the second guy, maybe he added that little detail so he didn't quite appear so dense. You never know. And then you got Thomas, who refused to even recognize the possibility that anybody else had seen Jesus. What about us? Would we recognize Jesus if we saw him on our way home? At the bowling alley? Standing in line at Walmart? Would we recognize Jesus if he was sitting in one of these pews? Would we recognize him if he were giving a sermon? I'm not him. If he were giving a sermon? I'm not him. Would we recognize Jesus if he looked like a hungry guy coming out of the Glenhead food pantry? What if he looked like the person holding the food needed, help wanted sign at the stoplight on the I-270? Recognize him? What if Jesus knocked on your door? Would you even answer? Thank you. What if the children should lead us? What if he asked for a drink of water, or it was an obvious stranger? Didn't look like anybody you knew. What if he looked Middle Eastern? What if he was Mexican and didn't speak English? Would we welcome him into our house? Would we ask him to sit with us? Invite him out to lunch? Would we recognize him? What if Jesus were naked or sick? Would we know that he was the king, the creator of the universe, or would we judge him? Maybe ignore him? Condescendingly toss him a pair of jeans and a can of chicken noodle soup? Maybe call the cops? Maybe call the cops? Would we recognize him? Now, of course, I'm picking up these images from Matthew 25, where Jesus compares himself to a starving person, to a homeless person, to an illegal alien, someone with no clothes, a sick person, and a prisoner, maybe even somebody on death row of these. In effect, what he's saying is when you've treated your most vulnerable in your society like they were just as important and worthy of love as anyone else, then you've treated me this way. But when you've neglected, ignored, judged, devalued any one of your fellows, you've neglected, ignored, judged, and devalued me. So apparently, Jesus is so you gotta love it when technology works. You gotta love it when technology works. He's so involved with the people he created, the people that he loves, the people that he died for, that when we see another human being, we are actually, in many ways. So let's take this a little farther. Would we recognize Jesus if he were a young person struggling with his or her sexuality? Would we have compassion for that person? Would we love them no matter what? Or would we judge them, leaving them to feel even more unloved, unwanted, marginalized, freaky, alone, inhuman than they felt before we met them? Would his encounter with us be a positive or a negative experience? Would we recognize Jesus if he were suffering mental illness? Would we help him? Would we love him? Would we try to help if he was struggling with schizophrenia, hearing voices, talking to himself? Or would we quickly move to the other the Pharisee did in the parable of the Good Samaritan? What if Jesus were a young, unwed, pregnant teenage girl? Would we judge him? Would we think he was immoral? Would we call him a slut? Would we force him down a specific path by limiting his options? Would we think that we're better than him? I don't know about you, but when you look at it this way, it's kind of discomforting. But you know, even though I've been, as long as I can remember, I've been a member of several different denominations. I grew up Lutheran. After Rita and I were married, we became Covenant, and then Presbyterian, and now we're Methodist. I went to church camp every summer, learned all the songs, taught Sunday school as a kid, or in high school. In high school, I've led adult classes, do a sermon every now and then, listened to hundreds of sermons, read books about Jesus. But sometimes I wonder if I would really recognize Jesus if he walked into a room, or I walked into a room where he already was. I mean, would he have flowing blonde hair, piercing blue eyes, pale skin? Or might he look more like, I don't know, Saddam Hussein, Osama bin Laden? Maybe Jesus is a black man, like I was told in Ethiopia the first time we went. Possibly. Would he be wearing a glowing white robe? Makes him real easy to spot in a crowd. Or maybe he'd be wearing a mechanic's uniform with his name on a patch over his pocket. Is Jesus a Republican? Is he a Democrat? Is he neither? Is he both? Does he own a handgun? Does he want to have an assault rifle? Is he for beefing up our borders? Would he depend on Meals for Wheels for a few hot meals and some fellowship every week? Would he care about the environment? Would he recycle? Be an interesting discussion to have with him. A woman named Claudia Mayer Burney writes the following in Will and Lisa Sampson's book entitled Justice in the Burbs. Larry, if you haven't read it, you should read it. Jesus lives next door. Jesus lives next door. He's an 8-year-old girl and her 3-year-old brother. The Son of Man looks like one of those starving Ethiopian children. He only gets breakfast and lunch at school when he makes it. His mama's a crack whore. Nobody knows where his dad heard. His mama lets her Johns do things to him. Poor King of Kings. Jesus is 2 houses down and has 6 children. Rookie. No. Now he's pregnant with the 7th. I don't know if he hasn't figured out what birth control or what, but how does he expect his husband to feed all those babies on that salary? And with all those children, the Lord of Lords can't work. That means hardworking taxpayer money has to go for Christ's food stamps. He needs to get fixed. Jesus is a crazy man, paranoid schizophrenic. If he doesn't take his medication, he walks up and down the street acting nuts. He's homeless. Nobody knows where his family is or even if he has one. He digs out trash cans for food. Somebody ought to get him off the street. Jesus is nothing but a nuisance. I'm starting to see the Son of God everywhere I go. He's always crying or begging or looking pitiful. Why doesn't he pull himself up by his bootstraps? This is America. To do something about him. Somebody. Powerful, uncomfortable words. 3 days after Jesus was crucified as a criminal on a Roman cross, due to the discontent he was causing with the religious establishment of his day, two of his disciples were having a conversation with him on the road to Emmaus. They didn't know who the stranger was, but they walked with him nonetheless. When they got to their destination, they urged the stranger, "Stay with us, it's nearly evening. The day's almost over." And so, urged the stranger, "Stay with us, it's nearly evening. The day's almost over." And so, because he was invited, he accepted the invitation to stay with them. And they made him a meal. And when he sat down at the table, he took the bread, he blessed it, and he broke it. And he gave it to them, and their eyes were opened, and they were saying to each other, "The Lord really has risen. The Lord has risen." It was 2 weeks ago. The Lord has risen. Okay, we know that. The other disciples were going, "Huh? Really? No. Really? No. You got what? Were you smoking the same thing the girls were this morning?" Then Jesus appeared to them, and they all knew. Is that what it'll take? Jesus to appear before we believe it? Do we say he's risen indeed just because it's a habit? It's what we do? Or do we really believe it? Do we know Jesus is the one who travels along the pathways of our lives with us? Maybe he was broken down on the side of the road with 2 small children. Maybe he's the boy who just had his book slapped out of his arms in the hallway between classes. Maybe he's the girl sobbing quietly into her locker, but for no apparent reason. Do we recognize Jesus in our friends, in our relatives? Do we recognize Jesus? Do we even look for Jesus in our enemies? In those with different opinions or political views? In the face of strangers? Do we even look him in the face as we walk down the sidewalk? Even when he's just asking for a buck to get a cup of coffee? If Jesus wanted to be part of our conversations, would we welcome him? None of your business. Even if he scorned us, would we welcome him in? If he was on social media, would we like and follow him? Or would we block him if he said something that made us uncomfortable? How often would the things that we post on social media get a like from him? Do we know Jesus as the one who's looking, waiting to come into our hearts, waiting for the invitation? Would we invite him into our homes if he knocked? Would we even do it if he was dirty and hadn't been within shouting distance of soap and deodorant for a while? Would we make him a meal? Do we know the one who died and rose so that we might know him? Would we even recognize him? Would we even try? Or would we just keep walking? Pray with me. Outcast God, you were born and made homeless as you were driven from your land as your family fled violence, living alongside marginalized and the oppressed, dying between criminals to the jeers of a crowd. Open our eyes that we who seek to follow you may recognize your face in the faces of those who are seek to follow you, may recognize your face in the faces of those who are enslaved. Open our ears that we who seek to hear your word may recognize your love in the stories which are often drowned out. Open our hearts that we who seek your